All right, we are going to get started today. I just would like to welcome everyone to JOMA's Teen Health Initiative webinar series. My name is Dr. Elissa Hellman. I will be your moderator today. I am a board-certified OBGYN and owner of the private telemedicine practice called The Confident Kala. And I'd really like to introduce the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association and the Teen Health Committee. The Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association, also known as JOMA, is a nonprofit organization whose membership includes Jewish Orthodox female physicians and trainees. Our goal is to provide evidence-based preventative health and women's health education to the Orthodox Jewish community. Today, we will address the topic of educating teens about their changing bodies. We believe that an early and straightforward approach to health education for teens can set them up for a healthy and balanced life. Thank you for being partners with us in promoting teens' health education. Also, if you have not done so already, please take a minute or two to fill out the pre-webinar survey. You can find the link to the survey in the chat. There will also be a post-webinar survey, which you'll receive after today's webinar. Please try to fill both surveys out, as this really does help us improve future webinars. And just one other note, this will not be recorded and sent out afterwards. We do plan to try and do these multiple times a year. So if you aren't able to catch the full one this time or this one, then stay tuned for further announcements about when we'll be doing these in the future. All right, now I would like to hand the floor over to Dr. Shana Frydman, who is representing our Partners Shalom Task Force. Thank you and enjoy the session.
It's such a pleasure to be here today. There are so many ways that the mission of Shalom Task Force and JOMA really are aligned. Shalom Task Force is probably most known for, can you see my shared screen? No. Sorry about that. Is most known for our work combating domestic violence, but much of our work is about helping foster safe and healthy relationships. And so much part of that is community education. So here we are today to talk about something that's really important to all of us. I want to just start with a few points. I have no idea why this isn't working and I apologize, so we'll just do it without it. I want to start with a few points just to give a little framework of how to think about this. My first thoughts around this is really, I recently read an article around talking to adolescents about puberty and to children about their bodies. And the language they used, I thought was really important, was that without adequate language, even in its first instance, names of body parts, children and adolescents will struggle to understand and express concepts of vulnerability and self-protection, identity and respect. And I think that's the core of what we're going to do here today. As Dr. Hellman spoke about, it's just critically important that we're able to set up our children for healthy relationships and healthy relationship with their bodies and accurate information as they grow. My few thoughts around the framework, how to think about this. I want to start with the idea of know thyself. In a recent article, another recent article I read, they talked about the idea that talking about puberty often creates panic in parents. That's actually a language used. And I think that many of us can relate to that. It may be because we had a hard time during our puberty or it wasn't presented to us. We might not have the right information. And by attending lectures like this, by reaching out to our medical professionals, our mental health practitioners, it's critically important that we know ourselves and we get the information. We don't need to do this perfectly. We just need to do this as best we can and get the support we need. The next idea I want to think about is the idea of outsourcing. I think that there is somewhat of a tradition that we think that our kids will get the information they need either, you know, in middle school when the nurse comes in or later when they go to their college classes. And I really think that we're all here today because we don't want to outsource that information, right? We want that conversation in our home to reflect our values. We also want to make sure that they're getting the information that's accurate and information that they could help them later. So to think about not outsourcing and to use those as complementing what we do in our homes. The next idea is really the gift of conversation. In so many ways, the ability to create a home and a family that has conversation about topics that might be uncomfortable at times is critically important. And the work that we do at Shalom Task Force, I would say that we do a lot of work about increasing conversation. We're not here today to have a long conversation about safe touch, boundaries, consent, but ideas around and the information around our bodies sets the tone that we could create safety around that. If children and adolescents have appropriate and accurate information about their bodies, they're able to communicate, right? So they're able to communicate. There's discomfort, there's pain, there's something that feels off, or if there's something that's inappropriate happening to them. And that is critically important to create a safety plan. When you also have conversations in your home that are not shameful, that are not whispered, that are there from a place of strength-based and positive, they know, our children know, right, that they could come to us in case there's anything that is not feeling right and if something's wrong. And then we together can work how to deal with that. And then there are resources out there. So as I move forward and I set the Zoom stage back to the doctors here, I want to leave you with 3 pointers. I want to talk about the idea of talking early and often. This isn't only one conversation, but it's a series of conversations. It's an approach in our families to make sure that our children know what they need to know. I think we need to be honest and real with ourselves about who we are and what support we need, and honest with our children. If we don't know something and we need support, we reach out for support. We're setting an example that if we don't know something, there's people out there can help us and help us do that. And to also know and constantly tell children and people that we care for that we're always there for them, right? That there's no conversation that's going to be too difficult, and we'll be able to help them through that. I think that gives us a framework to take all of this information we're going to learn right now and move forward to make sure we set the stage for our children's health. So I appreciate being here with you today. I hope that helps you look forward. And thank you so much for including Shalom Task Force.
Thank you, Dr. Frydman. That was great. So before I introduce our 2 speakers for the day, I would like to just inform you that we will have a question and answer session after the speaker is finished speaking. And all questions should be posted in the question box on the little chat. Now, just so you know, if you are on this chat, you are on it anonymously. And if you want to ask a question, you are able to ask it anonymously. You just check the anonymous button on it. Also, you'll notice that when asking a question, if you want to remain anonymous to the panelists, you just make sure you click that button. And as far as the survey goes, I just found out a little bit of a glitch. We will work on maybe sending out another survey link, but right now it is not currently working. All right, so let's get started on our wonderful speakers. So I want to introduce you to our first one. Dr. Yardaena Osband, MD, is an assistant clinical professor of pediatrics at New York Medical College in Valhalla, New York. Yardaena has taught in many schools, synagogues, and has been a scholar in residence in many communities. She's also the co-host of the Daf Yomi podcast, Talking Talmud. Yardaena also serves on the board of ORA, Organization for the Resolution of Agunot, and is a founder of the Orthodox Leadership Project. She and her family also started the Michael E. Osband Senior Swab Campaign with Gift of Life. Yardaena currently resides in Israel with her husband and children.
Thank you so much. Just give me 1 second to share my screen here. And I'm really thrilled to be here today and to be able to share this information with all of you. I'm going to keep my slides like this because I find it a little easier to go back and forth. So I apologize, it's not in slideshow presentation. And I want to thank Dr. Frydman for those words, because that really played in nicely to what I'm going to be talking about. So just to give you a little background as to who I am, I'm a pediatrician. I've been in practice for over 14 years. Also the mother of 5 children. And, this is a topic that I feel very passionate about, and is one that I think we really are not doing enough education around, particularly in our own Orthodox community. And I think to kid ourselves that our children are not getting some of this information from other places, especially with social media and what they have access to today, is really sort of just not doing our job as parents. And so my goal before I hand it over to Dr. Maslow is to really think about how do we frame this conversation with our children, and to really empower us as parents that this is part of our job as parents and that we can do a really great job with this. So I don't have any disclosures to report. And in terms of framing the conversation, so, we're Jewish, and I think that therefore to frame the conversation, we really need to be looking at our own sources about how do we talk about these things? How do we talk about puberty, intimacy, sex, and things of that nature? And so I want to share here a Gemara that, let me just see if I can get there. You go, so you don't see the speakers. So this is a very famous Gemara in Brachot. that actually appears in another text, in another Gemara elsewhere. And the Gemara reads as follows: Rav Kahana al Gana Tute Pure de Rav. So Rav Kahana was a student of Rav, was basically underneath Rav's bed. Now, this is a very shocking Gemara when you think about what this is actually setting up. Shmai deschach b'schach v'asat tzrachav. And basically, he hears Rav chatting and laughing with his wife. And basically, he's underneath the bed when Rav is having sort of an intimate moment with his wife. Amar le, so Rav basically, so Rav Kahana says, Dami pume de Abba kedelo sarif tivshale. So Rav Kahana says to Rav, the mouth of Abba, Rav, okay, is like one who never ate a cooked dish. In other words, Rav Kahana is sort of shocked by how he sees his teacher behaving. But again, remember, one of the questions on this Gemara is, was it appropriate for Rav Kahana to be there at all? Amar le, so Rav says, Kahana hachat. So Rav basically says to his student, Kahana, are you here? Puk de lav orach arya. So he says, leave because you really shouldn't be here. This isn't, this is a private moment and you shouldn't be here. Amar le, Torah hi v'limod ani tzarich. And Rav Kahana basically answers back to Rav and he says, he says, this is Torah and I need to learn Torah. And I think there's a lot to unpack here. I probably could speak about this Gemara for a full 20 minutes. But I think some of the themes here that are important is, first of all, I think what we see here is a student who sort of, in an act of desperation, because he wants to get certain information that I think is often considered to be taboo, does something that's actually very inappropriate and sort of shocking, and sort of invades his teacher's private space in order to gain access to that information. And yes, he is appropriately admonished by Rav, right, where Rav basically says, you shouldn't be here. And ultimately, Rav Kahana answers him by saying, Torah hil v'limod ani tzarich. This is Torah and I must learn. And so I think what we learn from here is that if we as parents, right, who are ultimately our children's first teachers, right, do not take the responsibility to teach our children appropriately, then I think we do need to, I'm using this a little bit as a warning, that our children may seek the information in ways that sometimes cross boundaries or in ways that we would not be happy for them to seek that information. And ultimately, also what Rav Kahana's point is, back to his teacher, to Rav, is that this is Torah. And I think we have to think about this in that context, that as religious Jews who are ascribing to a life of halacha and of observance, that this is part of our job as a parent, is that we want to raise our children to have a loving relationship with Hashem, to want to be observant. And part of that is to teach our children what our tradition is around these types of issues. And we need to consider this as part of our Torah education that we're doing for our children. Next, I want to look at a very, very famous, few psukim that we find in Sefer Micha, chapter 6, verse 8, Perek Vav Pasuk Chet, right? Higad lecha adam ma tov u'ma Hashem doresh mimecha. Right, this is probably one of the most famous lines of all of Sefer Micha, if not the most famous one, where he basically says, right, that I will let you know what is it that Hashem really requires of you. Ki masot mishpat va'avad chesed v'hatzmei lachad im elokecha. Right, that you should do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God. And I think the reason why I think this source is very important is that I think this word sniut, or modesty, is really used in very, very different ways in our culture today. And very often, I think we use the word sniut sometimes to sort of say, like, we're not going to talk about certain things. It's not appropriate to talk about something. And I think when we see the actual context of where this word sniut actually appears, right, where it is in this pasuk itself, it's really more about like doing what God wants us to do. And one could say that sniut has to do with maybe not talking about money with people. It's not just about like body issues itself. And
Dr. Osband, your connection isn't great.
Well, but also in a way that recognizing that in a way that, hold on, I'm seeing my internet is not stable right now. Can you guys still hear me?
It's clicking out and back and forth a little bit.
Okay. let me just see. Okay. Is it better now or?
Still a little
Okay,
back and
I'm
forth.
gonna just text
Yep,
me if
it's
you're
better.
still not able to hear me. I apologize.
It's
for that.
better now. It's good.
It's a little back.
Yep.
Okay, good. So, okay, great. Okay, so what I want to do here is, yes, we're talking about puberty, but I want to go through and talk about this in a context of how do we start these conversations? When our children are sort of pre-pubertal or going to start puberty, that isn't really the first time to talk about some of these things. And so what I want to go through, and I think we'll have some more webinars about these topics, is sort of go through a variety of different sort of stages of our children and think about ways that we should be talking to our kids at these stages. So the first one is preschool. So these conversations, as Dr. Frydman mentioned before, really need to start from the beginning. And so, some things that, I want to keep in mind here is to talk about is always using the correct name of body parts. Now, a lot of this, what this has to do with is, I think is very, very informed by how we or our spouses were raised. So I was raised in a very, very open household. And I think that's partially why I feel so passionate about this topic. My parents always used correct body parts. My father was a pediatrician. My mother was an early childhood teacher. And I really grew up in a house where we could ask these things and they were talked about very, very normally. My husband grew up in a house where these things were not talked about at all. And therefore, when it came to us creating our own family, these were things that we had to talk about. And so I think even before we start talking about our preschool children, this is an important conversation to have with your spouse, which is to think about what baggage do you bring to this conversation, right? What is it? How were you raised in your home? And how was your spouse or partner raised in their home? And so that even starts with just the using of correct names of body parts, because very often different families will have different ways about how they name things, how they talk about things. It's very normal at that age for children to want to touch themselves. And, I am going to use a word that may make some people uncomfortable here, and that can be a form of masturbation, and that's how it's talked about. But I think the key is when children do things like that is not to shame them and to really talk to them about, this is something we do privately. It's something you can do in a bathroom or in your room. But again, to recognize that these types of behaviors are actually very normal. And again, we'll be doing some more webinars in the future where we'll get to talk about some of these things in a little bit more detail. Another thing with preschool children is to really think about nakedness and boundaries. So there's a lot of talk with preschool children about, tushies or nakedness or laughing when they see somebody who's naked. You may have had a situation where you had a child who maybe wanted to get naked with a friend or something like that, that made parents very uncomfortable. And so it's important to talk about with children that our body is something holy that Hashem has given us, and it's something that's private. And sometimes things that are special are private, but not that the nakedness itself is something that's bad, but it's about creating boundaries around that nakedness. Also with preschool children, we'll see a lot of bathroom talk. So, saying things about pishy, duty, things like that. And the kids are cracking up and they think that that's very, very funny. And I think also some of these things are all about children trying to understand what are the boundaries around these topics. They understand that, these are sort of like a little bit taboo topics. And so our response to them when they talk like this actually really sort of sets for our households, how are these things talked about? So not yelling at a child, but saying, those aren't words that we really use when we're eating dinner at the table. Or I know that you think that that's really silly. Maybe we can make those jokes, when we're alone later, but that that's not really something that we make jokes about when we have company over. The discussions around good touch and bad touch, they need to be talked about already at an early age. And again, even though the focus of this particular webinar is, specific pointers about how to talk about puberty, and that's what we'll be talking about with the preteens and teens who join us next week. But, I felt it was important to start with preschool here because this all needs to be within a context of education that starts at a much younger age. And again, for those of you who maybe have not thought about some of these things or done this yet, this isn't meant at all to make anybody feel bad, but you may have younger children and some older children, and it's just a general way of sort of shifting your mindset about how to talk about these things. And so it's really important already at a young age to talk about what's appropriate touch, what's not appropriate touch, and also to really listen to your children. If you're tickling your child or your child wants privacy, if you're tickling your child and your child is like, stop, I don't like that, to really listen to that, because that's your child setting a boundary. Or, if your child, says, I don't want to change in front of you, or starting to ask, and sometimes we will see kids as young as 5 or 6 don't want to change in front of siblings or even parents. It's good to respect those types of boundaries. And then finally, what would be some signs of concerns that we would worry about? And again, we'll do, I hope to do a longer webinar about some of these issues. But if your child is talking about their body or, in a way that seems sort of advanced for a child of their age, or talking about certain activities that wouldn't be something that a child of their age would know about. And again, this is a whole separate topic, but I just felt like we needed to mention it a little bit. Those would be signs of concerns and something that you should speak about with your pediatrician immediately. Finally, we get to school age children. So this is what I would sort of consider our age 6 to 11, let's say, or 6 to 12. And so here, I think what's really important is that there's a lot of false information and empowering ourselves as parents. So I think one thing that we need to think about is, when is the right time to start talking about these things with our children? And I think a lot of us sort of wait until, our children are like about to hit puberty. And I can know, like, for the day schools that my kids have been in, they often don't have these talks from the school until about 5th or 6th grade. But honestly, it's a little bit late to be starting those conversations then. First of all, children often may have been exposed to some of these things from friends, from media, from TV. And I think that's something that we really need to consider. We have a rule in our house in particular that if you're going to be in a bunk, in an overnight bunk, a lot of this information needs to be shared ahead of time, because we didn't want our children to hear about this from other children. And so thinking about sort of talking about puberty and bodies changing, the time to start these conversations are actually not right when your child may be at the cusp of them individually developing, because I think we also need to recognize that development is really a range. So you can have a daughter who's in 4th grade with a friend who already has had breast development, is wearing a bra, may actually have had a period, and maybe your child is not going to actually develop or start puberty until 6. Some children don't even start till 7th grade. And if you wait for that to happen, they really are at risk of getting a lot of false information. And so again, my major message here is to empower ourselves as parents. You have the gift that you get to control what this conversation is going to look like. And another thing that I think is really important, particularly with this webinar, is separating puberty from sex. So today, what we're really talking about is how do our bodies grow into adult bodies? And that's a very different discussion about sex. And so I think we need to think about that in 2 different ways. One is that puberty is its own discussion, right? But also it's important to have that follow-up discussion in a way that is developmentally appropriate. And again, I know I'm talking about all these different webinars that we're going to have. We'll talk about how to discuss sex and intimacy at another time. But remember that when we start to talk about puberty, yes, there's an element of puberty that as a woman's body enters puberty and changes, a lot of that is so that then she does have the capacity to have children, but we need to separate those 2 different discussions. The experience of undergoing puberty, what it means to take care of a body differently, once you do have puberty, right, having to shower more often, questions about shaving, things like that is very, very different than any discussion about sex. So I think as we talk about puberty today, remember that we're having sort of 2 different discussions with our girls, but also they are related at the same time. And today we're really talking about the puberty discure.
Dr. Osband, sorry to interrupt, just 2 more minutes.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Okay. So let me go on here. And again, I think also to be sensitive to what media and entertainment your children are looking at. And finally, to really think about empowering your children with good choices. And then finally, we get to adolescence. So by the time your child is an adolescent, hopefully you've already talked to them about puberty. If they've hit adolescence, if they're 12, 13, and you have not spoken to them about it, now is the time to do it. Commit yourself today that you are going to go ahead and you're going to do it. But the keys here are really fostering non-judgmental communication. Any question they ask, or maybe they ask something that is silly or not true, we just talk about it in a very non-judgmental way. Where did you hear that piece of information? That's an interesting question that you asked me. You really want to emphasize their own safety also. And then, finally, that it's okay for them. We as parents, we can make mistakes. Maybe we'll do this really well with one child, and maybe another child, the conversation did not go as well. And again, and I know I have this almost on every slide, do not underestimate, unfortunately, and we'll have a different webinar about this, about the influence of media and entertainment and sex. And as much as we all try to put parental blockers on, and this is a whole separate conversation, that unfortunately our children are getting a lot of misinformation from a lot of different places. So finally, we want to talk about here about safe body talk versus talking about sex. Today, we're really talking about puberty, and talking about puberty is part of safe body talk because it's really talking about how our bodies are going to change, trying to find teachable moments with our own children, recognizing also that our kids live today in a very, very visual culture about many of these things, whereas we lived in many of us grew up in much more of a print culture. And lastly, again, I really just want to leave us with that knowledge is power. Remember, you are the parent. You are the only person who can give this gift to your children, and empower yourselves that you really get to frame what this conversation is going to look like. And don't you want to be the person who had the zechut to give this information over to your children and not leave it to anybody else? So I really, really just want to end with a real message of empowerment. Anybody can feel free to contact me after this webinar if they want to have any individual questions, but I know we're going to take some questions at the end as well. So now I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Bat-Sheva Maslow.
All right, let me just introduce her first. Thank you so much, Dr. Osband. Those were all such wonderful points, really great food for thought for all the parents here. So next up, we have Dr. Bat-Sheva Maslow. Dr. Bat-Sheva Maslow is a double board certified in obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive endocrinology and infertility. She is a reproductive endocrinologist and the director of research at Extend Fertility in Manhattan and Premium Health Center in Brooklyn, New York. Dr. Maslow lectures and writes on the intersection of halacha and reproduction, and is frequently called upon as an advisor for questions related to Hilchot Nida. She serves as the Director of Medical Education for the North American Yoatzot Halacha Program and sits on the founding board of directors of the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association, or JOMA. She lives in New York with her husband and 4 daughters. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Thank you to Dr. Osband and Dr. Frydman for their amazing first talks. And let me, hold on, where is my, oh no, hold on, one sec. All right. Why isn't it giving me a choice to show all windows? That's why. Okay. And it's still not here. Oh, here we go. Great. Sorry, everyone. And I'm going to put it into slideshow. Okay. So my role here today is really to kind of walk you as parents through, how best can we speak to our daughters about puberty? And the truth is, this is a very individual discussion that's going to happen between you and your daughters. And like Dr. Osband said, it might be different for each of your daughters or each of your children. I'm going to walk you through some of my experiences, both professionally and personally, and hope that, some of these kind of nuggets of advice might be useful for you as well. So who am I? On the one hand, I'm a reproductive endocrinologist, a physician. I've studied the intricate hormonal pathways of puberty for many, many, many exams. And I've had to memorize them and recite them back at oral examinations. So for many years, puberty for me was this very intricate, very detailed, very intimidating topic that I was being tested on. But I'm also the mother of 4 girls, as you can see in this picture. And as I started going through my training, my oldest, who are twins, they were like 4 or 5 years old. By the time I finished all this studying and was ready to sit for my final board exam, they were almost 10. And all of a sudden, this went from being something really academic and a test, a subject that I was studying for tests, to something that was very real life. And I really spent a lot of time thinking about how can I take all this information that I've learned from a medical professional role and impart that into my daughters in a way that's empowering and understandable, and allow their transition through this time period to be something that is comes from an area, a place of being proactive rather than reactive to the events that are happening to them. And I think what Dr. Osband said about reflecting sort of how you were brought up is really a good point. I was brought up in a home where none of this was talked about at all. I learned everything that I needed to know from reading books or from talking to my friends. I had very little of these conversations with my mother, for a variety of reasons. And I think part of that is just sort of the culture that we grew up in. But I also view it as an opportunity for relationship building, meaning I think that, looking back at some of my adolescent years, that was kind of the beginning of putting in a roadblock to being able to have intimate and personal conversations with my parents. And as a parent, I wanted to be able to take a different approach. And I wanted to be able to be the one that my children felt like they could be comfortable coming to talk to me. So my goals were to take this complex and truthfully very boring topic and make it very empowering. And one of the kind of real aha moments I had about thinking about it in this way was I was sitting at a board review course, a really boring, very in-depth board review course, and there was a pediatric endocrinologist who was giving us a lecture on abnormal pubertal developments. And one of the things he was able to do that I'd never been able, and all the times I had studied it before, I'd never seen it this way, was to be able to take something that looked so random and so unpredictable. Kind of everybody's going through this in different ways. And it's true. You look at it and every girl sort of develops differently. And we tell our girls not to compare themselves to one another. But if you take a real broad, top level look, there's actually a lot of predictability to this and a lot of sense to it. And if we can give parents some of those tools to say, look, this is how it may unfold, and you can then give your children some of those tools, all of a sudden, this is not as scary as it may seem. And so generally humans, we tend to fear the unknown. What's going to happen to me? Is this normal? Children sort of sense that things are changing, but if they don't have a roadmap, they're really kind of at odds with, what's going to happen to me? I'm just sort of passively waiting for something to happen to me. And as parents, we're also very worried. What if I say the wrong thing to my child? What if something's not going the way it's supposed to? Am I going to miss it? When should I be worried? So my goal here is really to be able to go through this time period with some critical information so that we don't have to be afraid. And just to share a funny tidbit, when I had kind of one of my initial puberty conversations with my daughters, one of them started crying, which didn't really fit with the conversation. And I was kind of like, why are you so upset? And she's like, this means that I'm getting older, which means that I'm getting closer to dying. And that was totally not the thought the mindset I would have expected any of my children to have, that somehow puberty means I'm getting closer to death. But that's where her head went. And, it's sometimes hard as parents to predict how our children will think of things and how we should prepare them for it. So, that kind of veered the conversation in a little bit of a different direction in terms of helping her kind of deal with some of these fears that she was having. But that's where I think so much of this is an important opportunity to go through this with your child together, rather than it being very one-sided. Okay, so we're going to cover in the short time that we have a basic review of the timeline of female puberty. What are some of the typical important milestones to keep an eye out for? And when is it important to speak to your daughter's doctor? Because we know as parents, we're always worried that something might be wrong. And along the way, I'm going to kind of share some of the strategies I used for talking with my daughters that I think might be helpful for talking, for other parents as well. So the first is we say, Chanoch na'ar al pi darko or al darka in this circumstance. It's really important to know your daughters. I have 4 daughters. They are all very different. And the way we have these conversations is very different for each of them at different times and in different ways. So I think that's there is no one size fits all here. We're hoping to give you some pearls that you can then take to kind of, you understand your daughters the best and you understand your relationships the best. The easiest is to start early and start often. This is not just one talk. This is a series of conversations and an opening to allow your child to come to you with questions so that it can be an ongoing discussion, not only for puberty, but for other personal and intimate things that may happen over the course of their adolescence and adulthood. But I agree with Dr. Osband. If you have, if your child is hitting adolescence now and you haven't had this conversation, use this as an excuse to talk to them. I have a very, very good friend of mine who is an expert on keeping teens safe from abuse. She posts all sorts of topics for conversations with your daughters or children, to be honest, that would be awkward to bring up. And my favorite way to bring them up is like, hey, did you see, or, my friend just posted about this. What do you guys think? Right? So use us as the excuse and say, hey, I listened to this webinar. What do you think about this? What do you know about this? Use that as the opening. If it feels awkward, we're happy to be that excuse. And just like Dr. Osband said, a prepared girl is an empowered girl. A girl who's going through this and feels prepared has an understanding of what's going to happen to her, comes at this from a place of feeling like she has some kind of control over it, rather than she's just waiting for something to happen to her body. And like I said, it really can be an opportunity for a bonding experience with your daughter. Okay, so nitty gritty. I like to call this stage 0, which is the pre-pubertal growth spurt. Okay, so this happens before puberty. It could happen as early as 6 or 7, 8 or 9. We say kind of plus or minus around 10. But this is really the first kind of sign that puberty is coming. If you look at these growth charts, the ones that you have at the doctor's office, where I put the arrow, there's like this little bump that starts to go up. That's where this tiny little inflection things start to change. And it may not be noticeable at first, but here are some clues. So the prepubertal growth spurt is not only a growth in height, it's a growth in a lot of other things as well. So the hands and the feet start to grow really fast. So all of a sudden your kids need new shoes. And so I noticed, a second pair of shoes in the middle of the school year is not something that's typical for my kids, but all of a sudden we needed a new pair of shoes because they were too small. It's like, oh, something's happening here. Losing teeth, right? So the jaw starts to change. So you get this like teeth that fall out kind of early in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, then you get like a break for a little while. And then all of a sudden teeth start falling out again. That's another clue that puberty is coming down the road. For those of you who wear glasses or have children who will likely wear glasses, this is the age at which the eyes start to change. And all of a sudden kids who didn't need glasses before now need glasses. So that's another clue that puberty is coming down the pike. And these are great opportunities to start talking about development in ways that don't feel as awkward because they're kind of less intimate, right? Glasses, teeth falling out, shoes. It's a way to kind of help notice the changes that are coming and a great way to give a kind of an opening to start talking about development. Once development kind of gets going, there are 3 stages. These are the medical terms for them. There's adrenarche, which is the start of the androgens that get produced. The androgens are what give us like body odor, body hair. There isn't so much of a deepening in voice in females, although it can be a little bit, but certainly in males, there's more. There's thelarche, which is breast development. And then we say menarche, which is the first period. So the truth is that for most of pubertal development, menarche, the first period, is actually the end of puberty, not really the beginning. Sometimes we think of that as the beginning of puberty, but the truth is for girls, it's really the end. And when I told you about that lecture that I went to that kind of really crystallized this for me, one of what he said was, you have to take adrenarche out of the picture. What happens is that adrenarche, the growth of hair and pubic hair or axillary hair, underarm hair, the deepening of the voice, acne, body odor, all of those things actually can happen at any point along the pubertal development. Some kids get that first, some kids get that in the middle, some kids get that last, and that's normal. So you kind of have to remove that from the picture and say, okay, that's not actually part of the overall. It has to happen at some point, but it can happen at different times for every kid. And that also is sometimes a trick. Like sometimes parents are really worried because all of a sudden they start to notice that their like 8-year-old has body odor. That's okay. Where the adrenarche falls along the pathway is it can be kind of random and can be highly variable, and that's normal. But if you take that piece out, the progression from thelarche, from breast development, and menarche, which is the first period, is actually very, very stable and can be very reliable. And it's basically about 2 years. So much so that in Pesach of 2019, I kind of noticed, okay, my daughters are look like they're kind of around this period of the thelarche, right? Like we're talking about getting, training bras, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And I kind of made a mental note that, okay, in Pesach, 2 years later, like I should be on the lookout for menarche. And it was like almost one got her first period like right on Chol Hamoed Pesach. I think the other one got it on Shavuos, right? So it happened to be I was lucky because it like fit with Yontiv, and so I remembered it, which is sometimes hard to remember. But it's really very, very within a few months. It's very, very reliable, and this can help us because we can know what to expect. Okay, so first we're going to talk about stage 1, thelarche, breast budding. What does this mean? So breast budding is really the first sign of breast development. It happens as a result of the rise in estrogen levels, right? Estrogen is the natural female hormone. It's what our ovaries produce when we start to have menstrual cycles. But starting from when we're young, estrogen levels are going to start to creep up. True breast buds are sensitive to touch. So you can have children who have a little bit of fat padding around the chest that they've had even since they were little. That's not really a breast bud. And sometimes in larger bodies, it's hard to tell, but breast buds are firm and they're sensitive to touch. So when your child starts telling you like it hurts to touch their chest, that's a sign that the breast is starting to develop. It hurts when they jump up and down, right? Those are things that can be a sign of true breast budding. And like I said, if you have the opportunity to give your child that knowledge in advance, they're going to be more likely to tell you, hey, I think this is happening to me. And remember, the adrenarche part, the hair, the body odor, the acne, that may or may not come before the breast budding. But this is where the clock starts. Once you see true breast budding, you have about 2 years until the period comes. So that first period is going to come, the average age of the first period can be, it's a 12, 11 something, almost 12, but it's really wide, right? You have some girls who are getting it very early and some girls who are getting it very late. And this is where it's important to kind of empower your daughters to not only for themselves, but for their friends. Remember that it can be normal to have irregular cycles. We pretty much see most girls will regulate within 3 years of menarche, but it actually can take up to 8. And so I see parents who come to me with their adolescents who are really, really concerned about their daughter's irregular periods. And many, many times this is not something that needs to be concerned about. Okay, so here's my tip for these stages is to kind of be aware and be ready for the next stage and prepare your daughter in advance for it. So what do we do before the prepubertal growth spurt? This is what I did, and I do. I kind of have this conversation with my daughters, like, what ways do little girls' bodies look different than big girls' bodies? And I let them talk about it. Let them notice the differences. I, like Dr. Osband said, I name parts. I say, look, mommies and grown-ups have breasts. We name the parts so that they have the right language. And then I also say, let's be on the lookout for some of these changes that are going to happen to you and give them the opening to revisit it as many times as possible. It's good to kind of read books together, and you don't have to cover everything at once. And then kind of keep track of the milestones. These are some books that my family really liked, our favorite books. Obviously, different books are going to work for different families. My girls are pretty scientific and knowledge. They like to have a lot of facts, and they also love to read. So these books worked really well. The Wow in the World book is really geared towards little kids. Like my 5-year-old reads it. It has stuff about all different parts of the body, not just about puberty, but there's a good chapter about puberty. It calls it like the bumps and talks about all the new bumps that develop in bodies as they grow. Celebrate Your Body. I read a lot before I gave it to my girls. I read a lot of these puberty books for girls. Some are much better than others, I will tell you. I like this one. I thought it was very factual. I thought it was very non-judgmental. But like I said, what's going to work for one family may not work for another. My girls really liked this book, and actually they kept referring back to it many times. They would read it, they put it away. Then when they had a question, they would go back and look at it, and we would have question and answers about this book. Okay, between the prepubertal growth spurt, you've noticed your daughter starting to needs new shoes, the teeth are falling out, glasses, she's getting taller. Start talking about breast development, start talking about the adrenarchal changes that might happen, right? Body odor, hair, all of those things those are the ones that I think are most scary, like the hair, the body odor, shaving, all of that requires a lot of changes in their day-to-day routines that I think kids can find very scary. And so if we arm them with tools and tips, it really helps take away some of those fears. So I find, and this again works for me, that there's really little harm in having your daughter wear a bra if she doesn't really need to. I know as a mom, it's it makes me a little bit sad because it's oh, my little baby's growing up, but there really is for her, it feels like an opportunity to kind of be in charge of what the changes that are happening, even if she doesn't really quite need the bra yet. Deodorant, that one, depends on the kids. Some kids need that a little bit earlier than others. My philosophy with this is, one of the things I never really got to do as a kid was kind of try out all these different products. I think kids like to, being able to let them find which products worked best for them. It helps her feel more in control and oh, this is the deodorant that I like. It doesn't have to be the same deodorant that my mom uses. This is the shaver that I like. And everyone, I think that that's helpful. I like, these are what we use in my family. If people are looking for advice, I can't say they're the best. It's just what works for us. I really like the Target bras. They're very inexpensive, which is why it's buy as many as you want. And even if you don't really need it, it's fine. And I think that really, really does help a lot. It gives her a role in being part of the whole process. This is the time to start introducing the concept of menarche. Think, having your first period is can be a very scary situation and a scary thing to think about. So giving them as much information in advance as possible. Remember, you have 2 years from breast development. So that's a lot of time to have good prepared conversations. As you get closer to menarche, most girls are going to have had the adrenarche, all the androgen type stuff by now. Not all, but so most are shaving and using deodorant. But again, not all. And there's really part of this is keeping shame out of it. It's uncomfortable for girls to feel these now they smell, they have to shave, but to be able to let them know this is normal, we're all going through it, and let them have choices. But I think what's really critical is to arm your daughter to be prepared for her first period. So I, together with my daughters, created this little emergency kit. I bought this cute little bag from Amazon. I have some flushable wipes, there's tampons, there's pads, there's a pair of period underwear. And I gave it to them well in advance of when I expected their first period would be. And we went through it and I said, these are all these things, we can talk about how to use them, but I want you to keep it with you because I don't want you to get caught in a situation where you don't have tools that you need. I also really tried to help them understand who are their helpers. What happens if you got your period at school? Who do you go to? If you got your period period at camp? Who do you go to? What if you need something? Who can you go to help? And I found that really, really worked in trying to help give my girls the power to feel like they were in control. And, you know, when it happened, if one of my girls got her period at camp, she did the right thing. She was really embarrassed. She didn't have her stuff with her, whatever it may be. She went to the camp nurse, the camp gave her, you know, and they called home, you know, they did all the things we know as adults they would do, but kids don't know that yet. They don't know that there are women out there who can help them. So arm them with the opportunity of, if you need help, it's okay. This happens all the time. There are lots of people available to help you. Okay.
Dr. Maslow, just another couple of minutes.
Okay, I'm almost there.
Okay.
Okay, so menarche, your daughter gets her first period, you know, obviously supporting her, empowering her. There is a million different products out there today, so many more than when we were kids. And remember that like what she likes in the beginning may not be something that she likes at the end, and being able to give her options to try things is really important. I'm a huge fan for my girls of these new period underwear. This is a ad from Thinx, which is the company that I think kind of developed them. The Thinx ones are super expensive, but I bought a million of like the Thinx knockoffs from Amazon that are much less expensive. Even if they're not thick enough to hold, you know, to be used alone without any other kind of, you know, pad or tampon. They are very good for like overflow. They're very good for like, if you think you're getting period, but you're not sure, like kind of early. They're pretty comfortable. Like the girls that don't really feel the difference. And it really saves the girls from being worried about there being some kind of stain, it leaking and all of that. Like that's a big anxiety for girls. Find out how much your girl really wants you to be involved in tracking her cycles, right? Some moms are like, okay, I'm putting it down on my calendar and I'm going to mark down and be like, honey, you should be getting your period sometime soon. Like some girls want that and some girls really, really don't want that. And so it's, you know, it's okay. You should kind of do this together. And then reassure her tons that it is normal for there to be a lot of variation, especially in the beginning. The cycles are not going to be exactly the same. They may not be exactly 28 days, and that is okay. Just reassure her that it's normal. There are times where you can have long stretches of irregularity. You can go months without getting a period as an adolescent, and that's okay. That's normal, especially within the first 3 years of menarche. Something called polycystic ovarian syndrome. As adults, we may have heard of it. It includes a lot of skipped cycles. True polycystic ovarian syndrome, despite the fact that there's a lot of 16-year-olds that get diagnosed with it, true PCOS in adolescence is actually extraordinarily rare. I would keep an eye on your daughter's pain. Is she having associated symptoms, right? Pain and cramping and all of that is normal, but things like vomiting and diarrhea may not be quite as may be more concerning. Is she missing school because of her periods? If your daughter is consistently missing school because of her periods, that's something that might be worth discussing with your doctor. There is something called endometriosis that we don't really want to miss. And historically, it's been clear that that endometriosis-like syndromes have been missed in adolescents. PMS or postmenopausal syndrome, feeling kind of yucky and out of sorts before their period is very, very normal, but feeling significantly depressed, not wanting to do things that they enjoy doing, not wanting to go outside, those are things that could be a sign of something a little bit more concerning. And, you know, this is probably a topic not really for this discussion, especially since we're a little short on time, but there are a lot of conversations in the medical field about whether to use birth control pills in adolescents to help regulate cycles and regulate some of these symptoms. It is an option. You know, I always get upset that it got called birth control pills, because they're really not only meant for birth control. They're really meant to help regulate the cycles. And, you know, while it may not be the best option for a 12 or 13-year-old, it might actually be an excellent option for a 15 or 16-year-old. Almost done. What can we expect after menarche? Remember, I told you that the end of the period is really the end of puberty. The most of the height gain is going to happen before the period. You can expect about 2 to 4 inches of growth after someone gets their period. Breast maturity. Most of the breast maturity, actually, like the change in shape and size, actually happens after the first period. So that's where you kind of get from that like very young looking breasts size to a more adult type of breast shape and size. Like I said, cycle frequency can be very irregular in the beginning, can go back and forth between having times that are regular versus irregular. At this age group, it's highly sensitive to environmental factors, particularly sleep and exposure to daylight, which are often sort of markers of stress, but like kids who stay up late studying, can mess up their cycles. It's why college kids sometimes mess up their cycles. I'd also be super on the lookout for marketing to teens. So especially about like body hair and acne and smell and all of that. There are all these like stuff on the market these days that are kind of geared towards teens that are trying to almost be like predatory and shameful about smell and hair. And really, I think we should foster sort of environments that are open and not shameful. It is normal. These are normal things. And how do we address them is different for every person. But we want to try, I think it's healthy to sort of stay away from this idealizing a particular type of body look and image. When to get a workup, this is my last slide, I think. This is what parents are always super worried about. True pubertal disorders are very, very unusual. So remember, there's a high variation of normal. There can be benign early development. There can be girls who are late bloomers that are all okay. But when to ask questions? Premature puberty, if you start to notice puberty, like breast development earlier than age 8, it may still be totally fine, but it's worth a question to your pediatrician. Same for early adrenarche, meaning hair and body odor, but that's, like I said, much more variable. Delayed puberty, worth asking a question if there's no breast development by age 14, or if you see significantly more than 2 years from the time that breast development started to the first period. And if there's more than 6 to 12 months without a period from the first period, again, can be normal, but also might be worth bringing up with your doctor. And this is my last slide. I really appreciate, we're going to answer questions, obviously, and I really appreciate getting the opportunity to share this with you. There's so much that happens in this transition, and, having seen it from the intricate hormonal medical side, it's like mind-blowing to me that this happens to all of us without really much external factors. Like, we just kind of are set on this time frame, and it's just just such a kind of strengthening of my emunah and bitachon in like the way that Hashem created the world, that we have this really complex, incredibly difficult to understand system that just like works most of the time. It's really just incredible. And I think it's amazing that we're all here to talk about it today.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Maslow. That was great. Now we are at the point of the webinar where we go over all of your questions and try to answer them. We have received some in the question and answer box and in the chat box. We can see either of them. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Osband, and I know there are some questions you wanted to go over, and then you'll kind of delegate to Dr. Maslow appropriately.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much, Dr. Maslow, for your words. I hope together we gave you guys some good framing and the actual content itself. I'm going to go through some of the questions, and either I'll answer or hand it over to Dr. Maslow. And there's quite a number of questions, so we know we're going over, but thank you everyone for attending. The first question that I see here is how to deal with a father who sleeps naked with daughters in the house and refuses to wear pajamas. So I really want to thank the anonymous person who asked that question. I think that's a very sensitive topic. And I actually think that it's something that actually you need to speak about with the father. Questions about like, when is it appropriate to stop being naked in front of your children? So the advice that I would really give about that is at some point, I personally think, but again, a lot of this has to do with your particular family, and this will vary from family to family, what's appropriate for children to see or not to see. There are some people who feel like very young children seeing adult bodies can be normal and natural because it lets them see what adult bodies look like. But some families are very not comfortable with that. And that's also a very, very fair approach. But I think there will be a particular point in time where your daughter seeing dad naked is not going to make them comfortable. And I think that's a really, that may be an uncomfortable or a difficult conversation to have with dad, but I think it's a really important one. Usually that occurs around, I would say, somewhere between 3.5 and 5. And, again, I would sort of frame it in a context of, modesty. What are we teaching our children about how to present their bodies? How would they feel if, a grown daughter walked around the house that way? I don't think that's something that they would encourage or like. But I think you also can, another suggestion would be, if that's how dad prefers to sleep, is, maybe there is a lock on the door and the children have to be told, you need to lock on the door first. You can't just sort of walk in right away, because you have to wait till dad has clothes on. So I really appreciate that. I think that's a very sensitive question, one that happens more often than we probably want to admit in many households. And again, I think there's two different approaches. One is to speak to dad about, what is appropriate, what's making children comfortable and not comfortable. But I also think it's okay to set a boundary with children that maybe, mom and dad's bedroom is not a place that they can just sort of walk into, and they need to knock first, so that, dad can put on a pair of pants, or to put on a pair of pajamas. The next question that we have here, just give me 1 second, is there was a couple of questions about deodorant and using deodorant. So I'll start with an answer to that, and then I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Maslow. So there was a question about, what do you do with a child who really does have body odor and doesn't want to use deodorant? And then also, is deodorant safe before they have pubic hair? So sometimes body odor is actually the first sign of puberty that we'll have in some children. And it's not uncommon that there are some kids who are really resistant to sort of the changes in hygiene that need to take place when they start with puberty. So refusal to shower, refusal to wear deodorant, refusal to maybe change their clothes frequently, especially if they get very sweaty. And I think the key here is to really sort of not lose patience, not make it into a battle. Some of the things that Dr. Maslow talked about, take them to the store, let them pick out their own, body soap, something that smells good to them, their own deodorant, make them part of the process. But there are some kids who this is sort of their way, I think, of a little bit of expressing control over some of the changes that their body is undergoing. And it really just takes us being, as parents, like a little bit, patient, and talking them through and really discussing with them, like, you smell, and, this isn't really how you want to present yourself to the world. It's going to make other people, not be comfortable around you. And it's part of your responsibility as you get older. And it's not going to be, sometimes for some kids, a one-time conversation. It may be something that you need to speak about over and over again. Dr. Maslow, do you have anything you want to add to that conversation?
No, I think that's exactly right. Actually, looking at my girls and how they develop, one needed deodorant much earlier than anybody else. And it didn't really help that her sisters started calling her names as a result of it. Right. So that was something we wanted to kind of diffuse, because certainly we want to not be shameful about it, but it was hard. She was one of the first ones in her class to need deodorant. One of the things I did was talk to another mom in her class and say hey, one of her best friends, maybe they should do this together. That didn't really kind of go out well. We just kind of, over the course of a year or so, worked on it. And we talked, she now she prefers to shower more frequently. So she showers in the morning before she goes to school, so that she's less stinky at school. It's really, in my philosophy has been to try to open up the conversation and keep it going. Me just saying here, use this and don't, and that's it. It's just not going to fly. And I think being able to have her kind of, even if it didn't happen right away, but it be part of this ongoing discussion. And now we're sort of in a good groove with where things will go. So it is a little scary. And sometimes if deodorant is the first thing, or shaving is, whatever the first thing is, whether it's deodorant or it's a training bra, it's scary for kids. I think there are many girls who are very resistant to it at first. There are moms who are resistant to it too. It feels like all of a sudden our little girls are growing up. It's really hard to embrace that. So it's a process.
Right. And I think recognizing that some kids, it's going to be more of a process with than others. And it's our job to stay calm and to parent them through it. Dr. Maslow, there's a bunch of questions we have here about safety issues. So safety of using tampons, safety of using the cum, safety of using deodorant. So what I would answer to that, and let you get into more details, is those things really are all safe. I think some of that, comes from, again, somehow what we were brought up on. There's a lot of sort of, let's say, urban legend stuff about like using tampons, using cups. They're safe to use at a young age. I think the issue is you really need to know, is your child, independent and responsible enough that they're not going to forget to remove a tampon or forget to remove a cup. That to me would really be the issue. It's not an issue about, using it before marriage, but there's a whole set of questions about that. How would you respond to that?
So I think that's exactly right. These, what I think is amazing about what's happening right now is that there is just so much choice out there. Not every girl is going to need the same thing. Not every girl is going to need the same thing throughout her like adolescence, right? So what might be good at age 11 may not be good at, might be different than what's good at age 15. So to me, this is all good. Having more choices is better. But using those choices wisely, is good. And being able to have conversations with your girls. Not every, girl who gets her first period is going to be comfortable using a tampon. It's not, we all know, for those of us who have done it, it's not so easy at first. It's uncomfortable. They may not be as comfortable with their bodies. Their bodies are obviously smaller than adult bodies. So it's a challenge. And it also depends on how motivated your daughter is. Like if your daughter is super not motivated to try tampons, like I wouldn't necessarily push it.
It's not going to work.
Right, exactly.
It's not going to work.
We had a situation where we were going to a water park as a family. That really motivated one of my daughters to learn how to use tampons. I have one daughter who's really super conscientious about the environment. And really it bothers her that tampons and pads cause so much garbage. And she really wants to use a menstrual cup, but you have to, like, I'm not at all familiar with menstrual cups because it was like not a thing when I was younger. So it's something we will need to learn about together. And also, like, as Yardaena said, you have to feel comfortable that your daughter is going to have sort of the functioning enough not to forget about it, to put it in, to clean, I feel like the menstrual cup needs a little bit more, you have to clean it properly. It requires a little bit more maturity than some of these others. So it's it isn't a one size fits all, but you're right. They are safe. They're all safe. None of these, I know when we were younger, there were all sorts of discussions about toxic shock syndrome from tampons. That's really not an issue with kind of contemporary tampon use.
Well, I think there's one specific question here about that someone here was told not to use tampons until after marriage. So
that's a more halachic, hashkafic issue that I'm not really going to weigh in on here. I will say that I have many, in my hat as a reproductive endocrinologist, I see a lot of single women who come to me for egg freezing. That's a different story. But I will say I have lots and lots of firm women who have used tampons, who are comfortable using tampons, who are single. There is I think it helps women feel comfortable with their bodies. It helps identify if there are other issues. But I get, whether from a hashkafic halachic perspective, that's out of our purview for now.
Right. That's a separate discussion. But from a safety point of view, there isn't a safety issue. But again, that's for some people that could be a hashkafic issue. Is there? So then we have a couple of questions about deodorant. First of all, is there a safer deodorant to use? Anything that's evidence-based medicine? And another, and I think sort of using are there issues with using long-term hormones, with birth control pills, or, in other words, that there's a whole push with some of the words specifically here with all hormones given to eggs and poultry. Is it important to encourage more organic products? So I guess I would, sort of put all of this together. How do we feel about, or what evidence is there about sort of the safety of the ingredients that are in deodorant, and also sort of long-term hormonal use, to regulate periods and things like that?
I think the evidence around exposures to phytoestrogens and plastics and BP and all of that is really still developing. We have seen, there is some evidence that, let's say, puberty is sort of shifting slightly younger. There have been some people that have speculated that that's because of these exposures that we all have in our modern society. It's a little unclear if that's really a true connection or not. But, you know, like in my house, we switched from plastic Tupperware to glass, not only for that reason, but like partially something to consider. But generally speaking, I think, you know, the amount of exposures to toxins that we experience in our everyday cosmetics is relatively low, certainly lower than it was when we were all younger. My kids all have sensitive skin. Generally, young girls tend to have sensitive skin. So some of the more natural deodorant products might be more helpful for them just because their skin is sensitive. So like I put up there the Dove products, that seems to work well for my family. There's Loom, which is was developed by an OBGYN. That's supposedly a more natural product. Yeah, I think there's some of that out there. It's nearly impossible to completely eliminate exposures from your everyday activities. Even if you went completely organic and got rid of all plastics, it's nearly impossible to eliminate it all. And it's not clear that that's really having a significant impact. So I think it's good, but we should not like drive ourselves crazy over this. In terms of the birth control and hormonal exposure, that's a really good question. I know I brought it up very briefly in my talk. You know, it used to be, there's still, I think, medically a lot of controversy around, you know, how young is too young to start birth control pills. There was a discussion that if you start birth control pills before full breast development, remember I told you breast development tends to happen in the 2 to 3 years after the first period, that if you start birth control pills before full breast development, that the breast development can be altered. And so there are a lot of people who are hesitant. I think all things being equal, most people would prefer to wait until the breast development has completed, until they've reached sort of their maximal height. So that's like 16-ish. But in the set, it's got to be a cost benefit analysis. So if you have a girl who is getting extreme, you know, she's having mood symptoms with her period, or she's having extraordinary pain, so she's missing school, or her periods are so heavy that she needed, you know, she's going to the doctor or passing out or needs a blood transfusion. I mean, all these things that could happen, these are extremes, but in those settings, it might be worth it to put your 12 or 13-year-old on birth control pills because, you know, you kind of sacrifice a little bit of breast development for them to be able to carry on a more functional life. So, you know, al regel achas, that's kind of my top thought on the birth control pills.
So we really have a lot of questions here, and I'm not sure, unfortunately, we're going to be able to get to all of them. Yes. I'm almost thinking maybe you and I should just do a Q&A one time, which would be great. So I don't know if we can end. I just one last question that's here. There's a lot of questions about hair removal that I'm seeing, you know, how hairy is too hairy? When can you start electrolysis? So I think that's its own question. The only thing I would sort of weigh in on in here is, you know, we're in a culture today, which is very sort of encouraging of hair removal. And I think it's really important to sort of balance with our children that having hair is natural. You know, actually having hair and the adult hair we get through puberty is actually protective of certain things. I can tell you as a pediatrician, because we see sometimes some very early hair removal, particularly in the genital area, that we see ingrown hairs and other infections that are caused from that. And so I think we have to be sensitive to sort of like not encouraging hair removal too early, especially if that is not our child's you know, need. So a lot more to unpack about that. But that really sort of has to do with an overall trend of, you know, wanting to remove hair at a very young age, and then, you know, sort of putting that with our kids as well. So I think that's something to be a little bit sensitive to. And then I'll hand it over to Dr. Hellman, I think, to wrap this up.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. This was great. I know this is a topic all of us can talk about forever. We're all very passionate about it. I just want to thank you guys both for joining us. We really hope for everyone still here that this was a helpful and informative session for you. And just wanted to give a few more reminders before we close. One, please do not forget to register for next week's session. So this is going to cover similar material, but geared towards your teenage or preteen girls themselves. So it will be easy for them to understand, and maybe a great opportunity to kind of start this conversation with them. I know that my 12-year-old daughter is excited to be watching next week. So it has to be registered for a separate Zoom link. It is not the same link that you joined with today for this webinar. So please sign up again, and you know, we will be advertising for that as well. Number two, if you have any questions and we didn't get to yours today or any feedback at all, our survey link is not currently working, so please email teenhealth@joma.org. And you can ask questions, you can give your feedback. The feedback really does help us with our webinar planning, and we hope to be able to provide this teen education multiple times throughout the year. And then we do also want to make one more mention. Hold on, something just happened with my slides. All right, that a special thank you to the Jewish Press for recognizing the importance of this work and helping us get the word out. And as always, a huge thank you to the whole team at JOMA and the Teen Health Committee, Dr. Elissa Minkin, Dr. Mimi Knoll, Dr. Gail Gutman, Dr. Mira Hellman-Ostrov, Hadassah Gutman, Miri Korlansky, Chaya Miller, Dr. Benayoun, and all of the medical students who really helped make webinars like this possible. If you have any questions after the session, again, email teenhealth@joma.org. And thank you so much for joining, and we can't wait to see you next Sunday. Bye-bye.